You are listening to People, Place, and the Ocean. My name is Jackie, and I will be your host throughout this podcast series that is inspired by the Gros Morne Community-Led Marine Atlas. With each episode, we will bring to life the pages of the Atlas by learning directly from the people who help tell the story about Gros Morne and its surrounding marine environment. You can download your copy of the Marine Atlas by visiting ecologyaction.ca and visiting the Marine Planning page. In this episode, we are back with Dr. Evan Edinger to discuss the concepts related to a sustainable blue economy for this region. This includes using the science that we have to inform our decisions about economic development within our coastal and marine areas. So now there's a couple of things that I want to touch on, but let's start with the Bombay Aquarium and Research Station. Evan, what are some of the ways that you've noticed the research station have an influence on the local community here?
So the CURRA project, the research station was one of the central pillars of that CURRA project. It goes as a home base for where a lot of students came to do their research from. But it also meant that the Voice of Bombay radio station started here. And that was one of the intentions of the project, was to help foster a culture of community-based research and using the station as an option for that. It has the benefit of being a scientific research station with all the typical scientific tools that you'd expect to find. And then we're adding to it things like the CTD and the ROV. I hope that the station continues to be a nucleus for where scientific research about the Bombay region can continue. And we have that continued interchange between local knowledge from fishermen and from local residents and scientists and students. Students are our heroes. They're the ones that do a lot of the hard work that leads to documenting those discoveries in detail that we need to do.
Yeah, we definitely referenced the CURRA initiative many times in the Atlas. How can this type of research that you're involved in maybe help support sustainable economic development more broadly and perhaps with other economic sectors?
So this is a really important question. And here I want to talk about the National Marine Conservation Area efforts on the southwest coast. So the town of Burgeo started that back in the 90s, or I think I heard about it in the early 2000s, but I think they were already talking about it in the 90s. And that came from looking at the example of Gros Morne Park as being the economic engine on the west coast of Newfoundland, especially after the moratorium. And they're looking at the moratorium and all these fishermen out of work, and how can we benefit from that as well? So conservation, we have to view conservation as a form of economic development. And protected areas are a form of economic development, especially when you have that big green area on the map, whether it's on the land or on the water. And it brings investment. It brings federal money, it might bring tourism development. And it's made possible because you have this fantastic environment surrounding that people want to look at, but people also want to understand. And so that's the way to view conservation. In terms of sustainable economic development, conservation economies are part of what we have to look at. And if you look at across Canada, different approaches to Indigenous-led conservation, they're talking about the same thing, this idea of a conservation economy, so that our economies are not based only on exploitation of natural resources, whether that be a renewable resource or a non-renewable resource, but rather also about using the landscape as an intact landscape, using that for our economic benefit.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, Evan, and you really articulated that well, just how conservation and economic opportunities can be really working in tandem together. And I actually wanted to pull up a quote from the Atlas. From the executive summary, we have something in here that says, over 76% of people surveyed in Gros Morne, including fish harvesters, business operators, and community members, said they would support marine protection, and another 10% were interested to learn more about the concept. So with this in mind, I wanted to think about what marine protection actually means. And when we think about a representative marine environment, maybe if we're thinking more specifically about corals, how might corals be protected?
So since 2017, DFO has established a number of large areas that are closed to bottom contact fishing that are called marine refuges. Mm-hmm. And these are closed under the Fisheries Act. So the Minister of Fisheries can say this area is closed for N years for whatever reason. They do that all the time for stock assessment, or there are closures that are for you can't collect shellfish here because it's too close to a sewage outfall. That's also a closure under the Fisheries Act. So DFO has done these relatively large areas that are closed to bottom contact fishing to protect corals and sponges. And they did that because they wanted to protect areas, and we had the data on corals and sponges. And it was, you could almost call it low-hanging fruit for them. Under the UN, there's a UN resolution that requires member states to protect vulnerable marine ecosystem species in their waters, and corals and sponges are included among those vulnerable marine ecosystem indicator species. So that was one of the ways that DFO approached that. And they tried to do that as finding the best compromise between maximizing the area protected, or the amount of corals and sponges protected, while minimizing the impact on the fishery. So if you look at the shapes of these, some of them have really crazy shapes. There's a big notch in the one up in northern Labrador, so that there's a minimal impact on the Greenland halibut fishery on the north end of it. There's another little notch, so there's a minimum impact on the shrimp fishery in the southern end. Okay, fine. That's DFO's job, is to find that balance. That's to protect these large offshore areas. Those are representative. Okay. When I think about Gros Morne, I don't think of it as a representative area. I think of it as a special area. And that's got a really important role within conservation. Why is Gros Morne a UNESCO World Heritage Site? As a World Heritage Site for its geological importance, which is one of the things I teach about, but it's also for its natural scenic beauty, which is one of the things that I enjoy as a member of the public who comes out here, and I have the privilege of teaching here as well. So it's a special environment above the waterline and also below the waterline. It's an area that really merits that extra level of protection. So what does protection mean?
Yeah, and what would that look like here, and why?
So if we were to talk about protecting the waters of Gros Morne, or the Gros Morne region and the Bond Bay region, to me that includes protecting the livelihoods of the people who live here and protecting the habitat at the same time. Kind of like DFO has to do with these large offshore areas that are made for corals and sponges. So let's look for the fisheries that have minimal impact on the bottom, and we want to make sure those continue. And if there's a fishery or another economic activity that looks like it's going to have a large detrimental impact on this environment, we should not be allowing that. So it's about finding that balance. We don't want to close everything down by any means. We want fishermen to keep fishing, but we also want to make sure that our habitats continue to be healthy habitats to support that fishery and to support other activities like tourism. So we can look at different economic activities. Fishing is an important economic activity, but when there was the talk about offshore oil exploration here in Gros Morne, you know all about the reaction to that. That's another form of economic activity based around non-renewable resource extraction. And somebody's going to make a big profit off of it, but it's almost certainly not going to be us, right? Somebody has to make a big profit, and who bears the impact of that? The people that live here. What are the impacts? Well, there would be the visual impact of having offshore oil rigs and how that would impact tourism. It also might not make you feel very nice when you get up in the morning and you get up in the middle of the night and you see a big bright oil rig.
Yep.
Okay. So that's an impact. That's not even accounting what happens if there's a spill.
At the back of the atlas, there's actually some more comments from local people who shared the responses to that 2017 proposal about the oil exploration, and it raised a lot of really good discussion about what kinds of economic opportunities people in this area actually would support or not.
Well, there's different forms of economic activity. Everything has an impact. We have tourism operations. Tourism operations have an impact. We also regulate those impacts, and we respond to a problem when we see it. The whale watching boats off of near St. John's, the way that those whale watching tours are run now versus how they were run 20 years ago has evolved because the tourism operators and the researchers at MUN who look at whale behavior are saying, well, we can probably do this better. So that would be true for marine protection here. So what does marine protection mean? Protection from what? Protection from human impacts. So that means we have to regulate our own activities. We look at each activity and figure out how can we do it better. With regards to fishing, we want to fish smarter. We would like to be able to fish in such a way that we catch what we want, don't catch what we don't want, don't damage the habitat, and don't overexploit the species so we can come back the next year and do it again. We all want the same things.
Yeah, exactly. What are the types of activities and economic opportunities that the people that live here actually want and would enjoy and would benefit from? Yeah, and I think you said a lot of really important points about how you need to think about what are we protecting our area from and who are we protecting it for.
So I'll bring up the other elephant in the room.
Okay.
And that's climate change, right? So the climate is changing. We can't do anything about it. We've already had our fun polluting the atmosphere, and now we have to pay the price. Who pays the price, and how is it paid? And that's the political question, but it's also a very local question. And so looking at what the impacts are of climate change on Newfoundland is a really important thing. Hurricane Fiona is a big example of that. We know that we're getting more hurricanes and stronger hurricanes, and in this case, Port aux Basques had the bad luck of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. Port aux Basques doesn't move. It's just that the likelihood of a large storm like Hurricane Fiona reoccurring is going higher because of the effects of climate change. That's a catastrophic impact of the type that's very, very expensive in terms of human cost and in terms of economic cost. There are other kinds of climate change impacts that are much more gradual because it's not a catastrophe that happens on one day in September. So we can look at climate change impacts on fisheries, climate change impacts on forests, climate change impacts on agriculture. And since we've already had our fun polluting the atmosphere and now we have to pay, how we pay comes in how we adapt to that. So we can adapt to that in terms of how we rebuild communities like Port aux Basques after Hurricane Fiona, but we can also adapt to that in terms of how we carry out our economic activities. Which fisheries are going to be managed how has to be considered in the context of climate change.
Yeah. So as we think about different blue economies, whether that's aquaculture or renewable energy or whatever that might be, what are some of the consequences that we might experience if we're proposing new activities in deep fjord environments without doing the proper research?
Oh, that's a loaded question.
I know.
So I mentioned Dick Heydrich to you a while ago. He and I had a student who worked on the fish around the corals, right? And he wrote a paper a long time about deep-sea fisheries. And he said, our scientific knowledge of deep-sea fisheries always lags behind the exploitation of those species. So what happens is we open up a fishery for a deep-sea species, and then when the population starts to crash, by then we figured out what the reproductive strategy is, maybe, if we're lucky, and what the longevity is, and what the recruitment patterns are, and we say we have our oh moment, right? We're on radio, so I can't say, you know what. And so that oh no moment is realizing, oh, if I knew then what I know now, I wouldn't have started this fishery or wouldn't have let it get this big. That's the typical pattern for exploitation of marine resources, is we go and do the exploitation, the research lags behind, and then we realize, oh, we made a mistake or we made some mistakes. That's in time. When we look at things like aquaculture and wind development, we don't have that excuse anymore because there's been aquaculture development in Canada for 30 years. We've seen the impacts elsewhere. So when we decide to allow salmon aquaculture, for example, we know what the impacts are going to be. And somebody is making a conscious choice to allow those impacts because there's going to be an economic benefit and there's going to be an environmental cost. Who gets that benefit and who gets that cost? Those are political questions. But they need to be considered when that management decision of proceeding or not proceeding with a particular development goes on. So fjords in Newfoundland. We're sitting surrounded by one of the best studied fjords in Newfoundland, in Bauman Bay. Another one that has had a lot of study in the past is Bay d'Espère, going back to Dick Heydrich, who worked there with Jean-Marc Gagnon, who's now at the Canadian Museum of Nature, back in the 1980s. That was Jean-Marc's PhD thesis. So those are some of the fjords that have had a lot of study, and they also benefit from traditional knowledge. There's lots of fishermen's knowledge, there's lots of indigenous knowledge around both those areas. So other fjords might not be as well studied. Every fjord is unique in some way, and we know what the impacts of these industries tend to be. We don't know how they might interact with that particular fjord, but we can make some pretty good predictions about that. It's important to get that background knowledge on each particular fjord.
Of course.
Yeah.
That really supports what you said earlier about how research in all areas is so valuable, because too often the case is that the economic activity happens first and then the research comes later. And that's the unfortunate case.
Yeah, we don't have that excuse.
Exactly.
Because
no, not anymore.
That's why there is an environmental impact assessment process, is because we've seen the results of economic extractive activities, mostly on a natural environment, and we see the impacts upon human health, the impacts on the natural environment, and we recognize that those impacts are unacceptable. That acceptable or not acceptable is somebody's judgment call, but who makes that call and what they decide is acceptable or not might differ, depending upon who you are and where you sit. Mm-hmm. I also teach conservation biology, and we talk about the importance of, you can't be a conservation scientist without also being an advocate for biodiversity conservation. That's why we do this. Yeah. It's just like you wouldn't be a medical doctor without caring about people's health, right? You're committed to protecting health. We're committed to protecting biodiversity. So that's why we do this.
Evan, is there anything else that you would like to add? Anything that you think listeners should know about corals, or maybe just about the research station?
I want to add something there.
Yeah, of course.
So about 10 years ago, not quite 10 years ago, we built an exhibit at the Johnson Geocenter in St. John's called Gardens of the Deep. And it's a little museum exhibit about deep water corals and sponges, sponsored by DFO, and is put in the Geocenter because it's one of the museums in St. John's. A similar exhibit is being built for the Bond Bay Aquarium and Research Station. It should be going in this year. So I hope they'll be using some of the Gadswell video that you guys have collected. I know that they're using some video from similar soft coral gardens that were recently discovered off of Funk Island. But it also will have a lot of information about corals and sponges throughout the province, but especially focusing on what we find here around the Grossmoorn region. So the value of that outreach is really important because if we talk about deep sea corals as having been out of sight and out of mind. Well, we want to avoid that.
Yeah, absolutely.
We want to bring them back into view.
I'm so glad that you brought that up. That's really exciting news about them opening up that new exhibit. Well, thank you so much, Evan, for all of this today. I really appreciate you meeting with me here and sharing so much of your knowledge about this environment. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Be sure not to miss the next episode and subscribe to the podcast now and follow along as we tell the story of Grossmoorn, the people, place, and the ocean.